Let me first give an introduction to David Skorton. David is the 13th Secretary of the Smithsonian. He assumed this position in July 1 of 2015. Prior to that, he spent from 2006 to 2015 as the 12th president of Cornell University. And while he was president of Cornell, he was also a professor of pediatrics and internal medicine at Cornell Medical College, and also a professor of computer and electrical engineering at the engineering school. Pretty impressive. Before that, he was the president of the University of Iowa. And he'd gone to the University of Iowa to go to the medical college. He had taught at the medical college there. He's a cardiologist by training. And he also became the head of external relations at University of Iowa and also the head of research for University of Iowa, and spent 3 years, as I mentioned, as the president of University of Iowa. He came there from UCLA, where he was the chief medical resident at the UCLA hospital. He had done his residency there after getting his medical degree at Northwestern University, from which he graduated in 1974, and he did his undergraduate degree in Northwestern as well. He is a native of Los Angeles and is now in charge of the complex that we know as the Smithsonian Institution. Let me just ask you the first question.
Can I just interrupt you
Yes.
for a second? Aren't you impressed he can do that with no notes? I mean, it's amazing, right?
Yeah. Well,
now, he actually got 5 or 6 of those things wrong, but it doesn't really matter.
okay.
It was done very convincingly.
Okay. I should have mentioned he's also an accomplished musician and has performed with Wynton Marsalis. So if any of you feel that you're not Renaissance men or Renaissance women, here is a Renaissance man. So, to be very serious, why do we need the Smithsonian? Because everything's online. So why do we need these 19 museums? And why don't you just watch it online? And why do you have to go see these things and touch them?
It's a really tough question, and that's one of the questions: what is the 21st century museum? And when you see something as an image on your phone or on your iPad or whatever you might have, and this is from working in medical imaging for a long time, you know you're not seeing the thing, right? You're seeing a representation of it. It's a 3-dimensional object. You're seeing a 2-dimensional representation of it. So it's not quite the same. But a deeper question is it good enough? Is it good enough to have that information done that way? Do we need to have the buildings? Do we need to have the multi-million-dollar buildings to store the collections and care for them lovingly and all the rest? And I believe we do. I believe we do. And I believe we do for 2 reasons. One, there's nothing, in my view, quite like being in front of the actual thing. I once heard of a man, a very generous man, who purchased the Magna Carta and actually made this available so the public could actually see it. And I went to see it. And it has a different effect, at least it did on me, than seeing it in some kind of digital form. I'll give you one more piece of evidence beyond my own opinion. Because I think we need to do more to get the public's reaction to the Smithsonian and find out how we're doing. We talk to each other a lot. We set up a youth advisory council. Actually, the mayor of District of Columbia, Muriel Bowser, and her administration helped us set it up. And we have about a dozen students from the DC area, sophomores and juniors from high school. And I asked them that very same question. We toured them around the museums. And they've never lived at a time where they didn't have something like this to look things up. They don't know what a paper encyclopedia is and so on. And their answer when I asked them the same question was, keep the objects, let us have the objects, and then use this digital world to put them in context, to have us be able to understand what they're all about. And so that's what I think we should do.
All right. So, Mr. Smithson, how come he got the naming rights for only $500,000? He got this whole institution named after him, and he only gave $500,000. How did he do? How did he do that? And it's in perpetuity too.
There's an easy answer because I wasn't there at the
Okay,
time.
all right. So how did it actually come about? I mean, why? Mr. Smithson was a British person. He'd never been to the United States. How did he happen to leave money, and how did we actually get the money?
So turn back the hands of time to the very early 19th century, and the United States was quite a young country. And this chemist, James Smithson, experimental chemist in England, never had been to North America, as David said, was very impressed by the ethos and the energy of this new country. And he made a deal that he would give his estate, his bequest, to set up an institution, in his words, for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. And that was the vague mission that we still follow to this day. And I believe what he thought was that there was a chance to help support something that was new and energetic and democratic, and he just had enough confidence to do it. I think he'd be pretty pleased if he saw what happened.
So he left the $500,000. Did the United States government say, let's go get that money right away, or what did they do?
This is a hard question. I'm having one of these moments now, a crisis of conscience, because I know this is being recorded. Should I say, yes, as always, Congress did the wise thing and so on? Should I make some jokes about Congress?
Say in the end, Congress did the right thing.
In the end, Congress did the right thing. But they debated it for a decade. And they couldn't decide what to do with the funds. And when they finally did take the funds, they put it into a certain instrument that
Arkansas state bonds.
I wasn't going to say that because, I don't want to step on Arkansas. And it all went away. All the money went away. Carlisle did not exist in those days. Had it existed, it would have been a different story.
Right. So actually, the Congress ultimately replaced the $500,000 and then officially started up the Smithsonian in 1846. The building that you now have an office in, the castle, was opened in 1855. So how is that building? It's kind of old now. How is it doing?
It was damaged in the earthquake that happened a few years ago in Washington. It's been put back on its feet, so to speak. It's an old building. It has a lot of character, and it's functional. And I give a lot of credit to the facilities folks at the Smithsonian who keep a building that opened in 1855 working, and I like it. I like it a lot.
How many people here have been to the Smithsonian? Any of the Smithsonian? Oh, okay. How many
nice.
people taking their children there? Taking their grandchildren there? How many people think it should remain free? Okay. That is the policy. We don't charge admission, right? No admissions.
No, I think it's very important that we stick with that policy.
So right now, you have 19 museums. So what is the most visited of those museums? 17 of them are in Washington, but what is the most visited of those?
It's always neck and neck between the National Air and Space Museum and the National Museum of Natural History. Whichever one of those comes in first is the most visited museum in the world, except for the Louvre. So they're very heavily visited.
And the Museum of Natural History, they have the Hope Diamond. And now, what is the Hope Diamond? Why is it so popular?
It's a big diamond, and people like to look at big diamonds.
Okay, all right. So nobody can steal it. You can't take it out, right?
Well, I never say never, but I don't think you should do that.
Okay.
You should try it.
So in the Space Museum, what's the most popular attraction there? The Spirit of St. Louis, or what?
Spirit of St. Louis is very popular. The Apollo 11 capsule is very popular, and I'll tell you an interesting story about that. We have a lot of partnerships with educational institutions. We have 210 affiliate museums around the United States and beyond. And we also work with companies who get interested in what we're doing. Working with Autodesk, a computer-aided design company, very prominent, excellent company, whose head is a Cornellian, I might add, just to stick that in there. They were helping us do three-dimensional scans of the inside of that capsule, and they discovered some things that had been lost to memory. Notes from some of the astronauts that in the rush to get out were just left there. It's amazing. And so now there's been even a recrudescence of people really wanting to see that. Spirit of St. Louis, very, very popular as well.
So right now, you're about to open on September 24th a new museum that Smithsonian spent a lot of time and money in. How did that museum come about? What is the museum?
In 1929, there was a bill passed in Congress to go in the direction of setting up a museum related to African Americans. And then in 2003, there was the serious bill that we're working with now, signed by President Bush. And on September 24, we're going to open it. There's a lot of debate in museum circles about everything. But one of the things is it actually good to have separate museums for different parts of the nation's demographic, or should we view everything as American and try to develop a large sort of melting pot?
Right.
And that same question comes up in higher education and so-called program houses. Is it important to have a place where students could live, predominantly oriented toward African Americans, Asians, whatever it might be? And I actually believe that both things are very important. It's important to have a holistic view of American history at a museum like the National Museum of American History, but I think it's also important to focus on certain aspects of the American story, and I think it's a very, very good decision that was taken years ago to have that. But I want to tell you something about the date, September 24.
Okay.
I have some emotional scars about that date, and I haven't had a chance to tell you this. I thought I'd tell you in front of a few friends.
What is it?
I'm about to tell you. So, when I first came to the Smithsonian, I was first living in Washington. I didn't know much about the ways of Washington. And they said, well, we're going to open this big museum, and you are going to cut the ribbon with President Obama, and we have to pick a date. And I said, well, great. Let's just give the White House 7 or 8 dates that are good for me, and they can pick one.
Right.
So my assistant said, would you sit down, please? So I sat down, and I said, I'm sitting down. The secretary is sitting down. She said, okay. You don't tell the White House what dates are good. The White House will tell you what dates are good for you. And so I've sort of gotten over it now.
So
that's a good date for President Obama.
How much money did it cost to build that museum?
Roughly $540 million, and the U.S. Congress, all of you as federal taxpayers, put up half of it, $270 million, and we raised, due to the generosity of Toyota, yourself, and many, many, many other corporations, individuals, foundations, over $270 million to this point.
Okay, let me switch to another subject for a moment. You were trained as a cardiologist, right? So should I take an aspirin every day? I always wonder.
You're asking me if you should.
Well, cardiologists always say take aspirin. I'm just curious, you're a cardiologist, do you recommend it? No?
Now, you're my boss, you're the vice chair of the board, but I got to tell you, you can afford to pay for medical advice.
You're right.
But really and truly.
I can't get medical advice. It's hard to get medical advice from anybody that has all your qualifications, so I would really listen.
I'm going to give you the 2 pieces of advice doctors always say. It depends, and ask your doctor.
Okay. And what about a statin? Should I take a statin?
Well,
Same?
it depends.
Okay.
I'd ask your doctor.
Okay. So how did you go from being a cardiologist and a pediatrician, or pediatric medicine?
Actually, I'm an internist, but...
Internist. So how did you do all that and get involved in running universities? So how did you get recruited to run the University of Iowa? You were minding your business as a medical doctor?
Well, it's sort of a long story. How much time do we have? Let's see.
I'll give it the short version.
Short version. I don't know how to give the short version, but I'll give the medium version. So I was seeing patients, taking care of teenagers and young adults with inborn heart disease, congenital heart disease, and also working on computer analysis of medical imagery. The beginning of that field, as I worked in it, was based in part on declassified military algorithms that were used for remote sensing, aerial photography, and so on. And so I was working at both the engineering college and the medical college, and they were looking for someone to run the research operation who had a sort of a foot in both sides of the campus, the medical and the non-medical. And so I did that job, and I had a few other administrative jobs. And it turned out, from my perspective, that an MD and having practiced clinical medicine, I think is actually pretty good training to be a bureaucrat, because you have to get used to making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. You have to listen before you do something. You can't walk in a room with a patient and say, don't say a word. I know whenever it rains, your shoulder hurts, and we're going to have to, get an MRI. And also, it's important to realize that there's a partnership, ideally, that happens between the patient and the doctor, and you have to make the real big decisions together, and that's how a lot of management is as well.
Right, so you did a good job there, obviously, and you recruited to Cornell. Tell me, when you're president of Cornell, you actually did something quite unique. You managed to raise money for a New York tech organization or engineering school with Technion as your partner. How did you bring that together?
I don't want to use the pronoun I for that. I was part of a big team, and I had a certain part in it, but a lot of people worked on that besides me. And the real intellectual leader was a man named Dan Huttenlocher, who was the inaugural dean of that college. Anyway, what happened was Michael Bloomberg, then mayor of New York City, and his administration, a man named Seth Pinsky, who was the head of the New York City Economic Development Corp., and Bob Steele, who was the deputy mayor for economic development, looked carefully at the economy of New York City after the beginning of the Great Recession. And being a forward-looking administration, they wanted to say, what does the city need to diversify and stabilize the economy as far as the eye can see? And they did a very careful analysis and decided that finance, fashion, media, and a few other fields, the trades, would be strong in New York, but that in the tech sector, it wasn't keeping up with Boston and other Silicon Valley, obviously, and so on. And they drilled more deeply into that and decided that there was a relative lack of graduate level, post-baccalaureate training in the tech disciplines, electrical engineering, computer engineering, material science, and so on. And so Bloomberg set up this very, very tough international competition, and a lot of fabulous schools competed for this. And I had connections at the Technion since the mid-1980s. The Technion's a fascinating institution. At the year that we applied for this, the end of 2010, Israel, less than 10 million people, had more companies on the NASDAQ than all of the European Union combined. And 60% of those companies had a link to this one institution. And so it wasn't me, it was the second in command of Provost Kent Fox, who's now president of the University of Florida, went to represent Cornell in Beijing at a conference and met the president of the Technion, Peretz Levi, and they were talking about the competition. We were competing against each other, and we had some of the very same ideas, so we decided to throw in together, and we won.
Right. So one person gave you $350 million for that. How did you extract $350 million from one person?
We don't use the verb extract.
Okay.
In fundraising, we use words like matchmaking. We use the word thank you a lot. We don't say extract. Right. Extract is a medical term.
Okay.
Medical term. So here's how it happened. This gentleman, Charles Feeney, is quite an unusual person. He went through Cornell in the GI Bill, Irish American, and was a very limited means, made sandwiches in his dorm room and sold them. They called him the Sandwich Man. And he was looking around one day and saw someone peddling goods on a cart and thought about peddling things and somehow made these connections that people make at a conference like this, really, and decided to develop the concept with a couple of colleagues of duty-free shopping. Sold the concept for a very tidy sum, and immediately took his portion of the tidy sum and decided he wanted to give it away. I've been told, you could tell me if this is accurate or not, I've been told that his life was one of the inspirations for the Giving Pledge.
It's true.
And his title, his motto rather, was Giving While Living. And a little tagline that he had, he told me once, and a lot of other people, that I want my last check to bounce. He wanted to give it all away. He's already given away over $6 billion, and I went to see him and got to know him through Cornell, of course, and his wife, and I was sitting in their living room, and not extracting, I was explaining a terrific project, and he said, how much would it cost to build the whole project? And I said something on the order of $1.5 billion, and he said, well, my goodness. Actually, he said something more colorful, but I'm making it PG. Okay. And then he said, are you going to phase the project? And I said, yeah, well, Dean Huttenlocher is going to phase it. In the first phase, we'll do X, Y, Z, and it'll be $350 million. And he said, okay. And I said, let's go over what you mean by okay. And that was it. That was the story.
Oh. So his lawyers or children didn't call you up later and said he didn't really mean that or anything like that?
Actually, I'll tell you a quick vignette. My old boss, who actually hired me at Cornell, Peter Meinig, is here in the audience. And he was chair of the board at the time. And a couple people, especially the head of fundraising, general counsel, said it'd be nice to have this in writing, because it was just me and him and his wife. And I said, I'm not calling him back to tell him that. And they said, yes, you are. So I did, and he said, well, what do you want me to sign? And we had our counsel, write up a very simple document, very straightforward. There wasn't a pursuant in the whole document. Right. And dropped it off with him. And I didn't hear anything for about 3 weeks, and I was quite nervous. And we were about to have the finals of this contest that Bloomberg was handling. And Pete Meinig and I and the head of fundraising and the general counsel were in a meeting at the Cornell Club on East 44th in Manhattan. And I got a call from Mr. Feeney's assistant. And he said, Mr. Feeney, I'd like to talk to you about that document. And my heart just sank.
Right.
And I said, sure, I'll drop everything. I'm sure they'll understand. Where should I go? And he said, well, where are you? I said, well, I'm at the Cornell Club. And I told him where it was. We know where the Cornell Club is. And he said, we'll meet you in the lobby in 15 minutes. So I said to Mr. Meinig, Chairman Meinig, I said, you got to come with me. And we took him and the council and the head of fundraising went down in the lobby. Lobby was jammed with people, as it often is. And Mr. Feeney walked in there with his assistant, sat down, and I was very, very nervous. And he said, I read this document. And I said, okay. And he said, I like it. And he signed it and threw it back at me.
Wow, that's pretty good.
I started crying. Mr. Meining started crying. The general counsel started crying. The head of fundraising did not cry. He said, I'll take that. He took the
Okay.
And that was the end of it. And
Did
this
Mr.
day,
Feeney cry? 'Cause-
he actually did. And to this day, he keeps track of the project and keeps track of a lot of his investments. He, as you know, worked in a firm, started a firm called General Atlantic, and he also developed Atlantic Philanthropies, one of the most high impact, in my opinion, charitable organizations.
Most of the money he gave away was anonymous until somebody added them. But,
It was anonymous.
so who is harder to deal with, donors or members of Congress?
I'm going to get in trouble no matter what I say to that, right?
We say they're both easy.
They're not both easy, but
not?
they're both interesting.
Okay.
Interesting, both interesting. I would say actually there's quite a bit of similarity, as a matter of fact. It's a very interesting question. Let me know ahead of time you're going to ask me such a question, will you? Both donors, philanthropic donors, and members of Congress want to be sure that the money is going to be put to good use, that it's needed, that it's going to be leveraged, and in fact, those two groups of people leverage each other, I believe. Well, you can tell me if this is true. I think philanthropists are more likely to give to an institution like the Smithsonian if they think Congress has confidence in it and is spending money, and vice versa. And so I think it's pretty easy to deal with both of them.
How much money, what percentage of your budget actually comes from the federal government, Congress?
About 61%.
All right, so the other 39% comes from?
Retail and philanthropy. The retail includes many things you're familiar with: Smithsonian Magazine, Air and Space Magazine, Smithsonian Channel, IMAX theaters at the museums, online purchases, stores in the museums, and philanthropy, for me, is breathtaking. You have been, as you have with so many things throughout the country, very, very generous. And the Smithsonian raises, as you know, over $200 million a year of philanthropy, which for an institution that doesn't have a football team or alumni, it's breathtaking. People really believe in it.
So how did you familiarize yourself with the Smithsonian? Did you like walk around to every museum and you introduce yourself? Do you wear a name tag, or that you just anonymously go up and say, I'm David Skorton? How do you walk around the museums?
Those are all the answers. So first thing, I was actually very, very surprised when they contacted me about this job, because I never worked in a museum. And I've been to a lot of museums. I'm a very strong believer in cultural institutions. In fact, I spent some time trying to use the bully pulpit, whatever one I had, to try to influence Congress and others to reinvest in the arts and humanities. A lifetime in science and medicine have convinced me that we're not going to solve our thorniest problems around the world or in our own lives by science alone. And so I was very interested in cultural institutions, and when I did get the position, I began to read everything I could get my hands on. I joined the American Alliance of Museums, read their newsletters, and when I got to the Smithsonian, my wonderful chief of staff, Greg Betwe, whom you know well, put me on a steady diet of learning about the Smithsonian, visiting all the museums and galleries, most of the research centers. I visited all of the major research centers except for a couple, one of which is in Panama. And I also met with the directors, met with the curators and scientists, met with fabulous supporters, people who believe in the Smithsonian, of which there are some right here, and learned from them because they know much more about it.
So sometimes you man the information desks at these museums?
I'm still talking, the secretary's talking.
Okay.
And so then the next thing I did was begin to walk around without my name tag on and talk to tourists and visitors. When they see me coming with a suit, they figured I'm a fundraiser and they would walk away from me. But I actually have learned a lot from talking to visitors, to families. And then also, I have worked some of the information booths. And it's humbling because you don't know this of everything. The most common question as asked, of course, is where's the restroom? And I actually messed that up the first time I did it at the castle. I was facing the information desk. The men's room is here and the women's room is here. And when I was behind the desk, I got mixed up which way I went. So because they were worried that such a thing might occur, they had actual, real trained volunteers standing behind me and a staff member nervously hoping I wouldn't screw this up. And when I did that, staff member behind me, over my shoulder, and I couldn't see it, I was told, did something like that.
So the building at which you're now, your office in the castle, was actually the tallest building in Washington for a while. And I think Abraham Lincoln used to go to the peak to see where the Confederate troops were. That's how old it was and how tall it was. But when I was a child, my parents took me to the Smithsonian, but they took me to see the Spirit of St. Louis, but it was then in the Arts and Industries building. Whatever happened to that building? Where is it now?
It's still where it was. It was the second building, as you know. It was actually called the National Museum, and it's where the beginning collections were all in one place, as you mentioned. And eventually, as each constituent museum was built and developed, that collection was taken and moved there and then greatly, greatly augmented. And that building lay fallow for quite a while. And through your help, intellectual help and other help and others, we began to use it again. So my installation, or as my staff called it, my imposition was there. And we are doing a lot of things there now. And in fact, we kicked off in that building, we kicked off 2 days ago, the 2016 Smithsonian Folklife Festival, which is featuring the Basque culture and California culture writ large. And we will get hundreds of thousands of people going through there, millions of people who will have some contact with it. And it's a fabulous, fabulous building. And we're hoping to use it for some more permanent uses.
Now, is there any more room on the mall for more museums? Everybody wants to have a museum on the mall, but is the mall going to sink if there are more museums, or is there any more room for any more museums?
The part about sinking, I don't even want to dignify that with an answer, but
it's all marsh, isn't it, or no?
It's all marsh, but it's okay. I think it's going to be all right. But I think the question whether there's more room is a very complex question, because the National Mall of the United States is called the nation's front yard, and people like to have that open space to do what they want to do on there, to relax, to ask someone to marry them, to sleep, to have a protest. And so I think the general feeling, which I sure share, is that we don't want to crowd out the green space and the space to walk through. And there's a lot of museums around there.
So you have 19 museums, but you also do research. But why do you need to do research? There's lots of universities that do research. Why do we need to have the Smithsonian doing research?
It's a very, very important question nowadays, and it wasn't as tough a question in the day that James Smithson wrote that he wanted the bequest to be used for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. And let's think about that phrase. The diffusion part, we all know from the time we were kids. You walk across the threshold in the Smithsonian and you see the Spirit of St. Louis, or the Hope Diamond, or something else. You're inspired, you learn, you're different than the day before you did that. That's the diffusion of knowledge. But just as much in Smithson's mind as a chemist, as an experimentalist, was the increase of knowledge, so that we're always understanding better ourselves and the world around us. And so from the very beginning, the Smithsonian did research and developed broad reach of areas of expertise. So for example, and there are many of those areas that have been overtaken by universities, but some have not. And so for example, in astrophysics and astronomy, we are collaborators with Harvard University, a fully accredited institution in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You don't know what that is. You think only Duke is a fully accredited institution. And we have hundreds of scientists between us and Harvard managing 2 ground-based telescopes, a space-based telescope, and we do a lot of research.
Now suppose somebody here or somebody's watching on the video says, okay, I'd like to help the Smithsonian, I want to contribute to my country, the Smithsonian is part of my country. How do they do that? How do they get engaged? Do they pick a museum? So they call you? How do they say, how do they get to give money if they want to give money or other things they want to do?
If you have a pen with you and this book, I was waiting for this question. If you have this book with you, Skortond at si.edu. That's one-stop shopping.
Okay,
Skorton@si.edu, and I will direct them to the right place.
okay. And today, the African American History and Culture Museum is going to open, as we mentioned, but there's some feeling that there should be a Latino museum. So what are you going to do about that?
Well, new museums are established by literally an act of Congress. That's a colloquialism that we use for a lot of things, but literally museums are established by Congress, not by us. So we are at the service of the public through its elected representatives. There has been this great discussion about a national museum for the American Latino that's been going on for some years, and so far that hasn't occurred yet. However, I strongly believe that we need to do more and more to tell the stories of Latino in America. We don't have to wait for a museum. It may happen, it may never happen. And so prior to my time there, an initiative was started in something called the Smithsonian Latino Center, which is a center that supports the study and dissemination of information about American Latino experience, but doesn't have a museum. And they worked on a program with the now provost, Richard Curran, an anthropologist who's worked at the Smithsonian smashingly for 40 years, to hire Hispanic museum-oriented people to learn and study and curate exhibitions, but be appointed in some of the other museums, American History, National Museum of the American Indian, and so on. And so what we're doing now is utilizing that and other venues to begin to tell more robustly the story of Latinos in America.
Now, the governance of Smithsonian, the person who's the chairman, effectively, or the chancellor, as it's called, is the Chief Justice of the United States. He's got a lot of other things to do. How does he have time to come and help run the Smithsonian?
Well, yeah, it's quite a board. It's 17 people. 9 of them are, just plain folks like you and me, of which he is one. And then there are 8 public servants, 6 sitting members of Congress, 3 from the Senate, 3 from the House, the Vice President of the United States, and by statute, the Chancellor is the Chief Justice. My last interview for the job was with John Roberts in his chambers on a Sunday, and my wife, Dr. Robin Davison, with whom I consult on very many things, she said, well, what are you going to talk to the Chief Justice about? Your interview, are you nervous? I said, I'm nervous. She said, what are you going to talk to him about? And I said, well, I might have to share a few fine points of jurisprudence with him, kind of thing. And she said, why don't you get the job first and then worry about fine points of jurisprudence? And so he interviewed me, and as you know, he's very, very engaged with the Smithsonian. He actually chairs most important parts of our meetings, and we brief him, as you know, on a quarterly basis. And he's hugely involved, as are all the other public members.
But when the Smithsonian decides to do something and he's presiding, are the votes 5-4, or are they just unanimous?
I don't make jokes about the Supreme Court, but
Right, they're 4-4?
I don't make those kind of jokes either. Actually, it's rare to have a vote of our board like it was rare to have a vote at the Cornell board, like it was rare to have close votes of the Iowa board, but they happen once in a while. And I think it's actually a very, very functional organization.
What is the greatest pleasure you get out of doing this job?
I'm asked
other than this kind of interview.
I actually do enjoy doing these interviews, but it's impossible for me to pick out just one thing. But I'll tell you my sort of top few. I don't even know how many this will turn out to be. I do very much like interacting with you and other people on the board, as I did at Cornell. I get a chance to meet people I would never otherwise meet, no way. So that's one thing that's really terrific. However, to be honest, more than that even, I enjoy the people at the Smithsonian. They do surveys in the federal government of how happy people are in their workplace. And among small federal agencies, we're tiny compared to the Department of Energy or Department of Agriculture. We're always in the top 2, 3, 4 in satisfaction of people working there. It's a very happy place. It's a kind of a place where people are glad to be there. It's a positive thing. They're doing things for the country. And we have an intern sitting here. It's a happy place, right? She's giving us the 20-minute sign. But it's a happy place to work. People enjoy it there. And so I enjoy working with the people very much. But most of all, I enjoy interacting with the visitors, with the tourists. Because you see, corny as this sounds, you see people's lives slightly change. You see the trajectory of their heart and soul slightly change when they're standing in front of something, or seeing their kid standing in front of something and seeing the light goes on in her eyes.
Okay. So why don't we take some questions?
That'd be great.
People in the audience. Anybody want to know anything about the Smithsonian? I should say, point out, is Risa in the audience?
Risa is here.
She is one of the regents as well, and thank you very much for your service. Risa was going to do another event at this time and got it moved around. And Risa, thank you very much.
Wait, tell them what she does. I mean,
well, she is the head of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation.
Thank you, Risa.
And a terrific regent of the Smithsonian as well. Okay, why don't we start here, and then we'll go around, and yes.
So you have an amazing physical plant that you're managing. How many feet in total, how many people work there? What type of budget do you have there?
How many?
What he asked to sort of give some stats about the size of the Smithsonian, number of people, budget. Budget is about 1.35 billion, 1.4 billion, 61% from federal government, 39% from retail and philanthropy. We have 6,400 paid employees. We have 6,300 in-person volunteers. And get this, we have 5,800 digital volunteers who do volunteer work over the wire, so to speak, or wireless, shows you how old I am. And we have millions, on the order of 12 million square feet of space. But that number, I want to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, because we also have a lot of storage areas. The vast, vast majority of our collections, like any museum, are not on display at any one time. So let's just say it's a big organization. And a couple other stats, 28 million visits to the museums in a year, roughly 28 million. 17 museums in New York, in Washington, 2 in New York, the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, and the High Center American Indian Museum. And so it's a big organization, not a gargantuan organization, but very far-flung. And as I mentioned, 210 affiliate museums. And you'll love this one, I think. We do research or have projects in 145 countries. 145 countries. So there's a lot of stuff going on. We have a project called Forest Geo, in which we're helping to study the life of forests in dozens of countries around the world with dozens and dozens of researchers trying to understand, talk about climate change, trying to understand what's happening with our planet in an empirical sense. Not a political argument, but what is actually happening. So a lot of fabulous.
The total number of objects that you have is?
138 million things.
And do you really need 138 things, or?
138 million things.
138 million.
This is the best question you asked so far. Do we need it? Do we need to hang on to those? And this is really one of the things that every museum director will agonize about. Should you sell some of them? Should you stop collecting? If something hasn't been looked at in a while, nobody's asked for something in the warehouse, I'll call it, should you forget about it? And from being an academic for 36 years, I would say never get rid of something that some scholar once thought was important, because 10, 15, 20, 50 years from now, somebody will want to know something. The Zika virus, they're going back and looking through our scientists' eyes at our collection of mosquitoes. We're working with an interagency task force about the Zika virus, something that, I don't know about the rest of you, even as a physician, came out of nowhere for me. I didn't even know what it was. And we're using something that's been there a long time, part of the collection of the National Museum of Natural History. Who would have imagined that that would happen? So I'm in favor of keeping it going, but it's costly, and it's a big job to conserve those items.
Okay. Albert, do you have a question?
Albert, how are you? I can't get up, I'm tied to something. I was going to shake your hand. Good to see you.
Go ahead. Get a mic there. Go ahead. There's a mic right there.
There's a mic next to you, yeah. How are you?
I just want you to tell everyone in this audience that the Smithsonian is free. Most museums in the country you have to pay for.
Very good point. Very good point.
The Smithsonian is completely free.
It's free. It's one of the beautiful things about it is a family can come to Washington or New York for that matter, but let's just talk about the mall. And I know the mall is near and dear to your heart. And can come there and buy their family a nice lunch, and spend the rest of the day free, seeing things that just take your breath away, right? Just take your breath away. So, yeah, it's a good point.
Other questions back here? Right, back the lady who in black sweater, and then the lady in the red. And then,
I'm interested in your visiting exhibits, and the splendid new exhibit on evolution that you have in the Natural History Museum. There was a visiting exhibit that came to the Milpitas Public Library in California, which was terrific and gave a lot of information that I think doesn't get out to the general public. And the sad thing was it was the only place that it came in California. And I'd love to see many more of those exhibits getting out, because I think coming with the imprimatur of the Smithsonian carries a lot of weight, and it was really beautifully done. So
Thank you so much. The lady's talking about something called the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibition Service. And it does just exactly what the lady so eloquently described, and that is take a portion of our collection and travel it out somewhere so people in a different locale can see it. And I wish we could do more of that. Between that and the affiliate museums growing all the time, trying to get out more, and of course through our digital presence. But we're with you in spirit.
right?
I had the pleasure of being in Israel a few weeks ago at the Board of Governors meeting of the Technion, and being in the audience when you received an honorary doctorate. And you were chosen among all of the recipients to make the acceptance remarks. I just want to say you were erudite, you were thoughtful, you were emotional, and for those of us who came from the United States, we were so touched that they chose an American to make those acceptance remarks. So thank you.
Oh gosh, you're embarrassing me, and I'm getting emotional about it
Do
now.
you have any tougher questions out here? We have some tough questions. Who's got a tough question? You have a tough question right there? Something tough.
Got it. First of all, thank you so much for raising the work of Eduardo Diaz and the Smithsonian Latino Center. They're doing incredible work. But Latino history spans over 500 years, and the Smithsonian has already acknowledged that our contributions have been neglected in their willful neglect report. Should Congress authorize a Smithsonian, the last possible location for us is in the arts and industries that you mentioned on the National Mall. Do you believe that an American Latino Museum belongs in the Arts and Industries building? And if so, what can you do to help us get there?
Okay, I always tell myself I'll be honest in these public conversations, so I'll tell you exactly what I think. Number one, I do agree that not only has the Smithsonian, but America in general has not paid enough attention to the Latino heritage. Some Americans think that the whole business of Europeans coming to the North American continent began at Plymouth Rock. It did not. And explorers from Spain, Portugal, and elsewhere were literally all over North America long before those things happened. So I'm with you on that. Number two, I think we need to tell the story more than we're telling it right now. And those are the two things I feel very positive and sure of. I'm not sure there should be a National Museum of the American Latino, and I won't express an opinion about that in public because, as you know, the way it works, and I've met with the group, the Friends of the National Museum of the American Latino, I'll be glad to meet again and again and again, is that Congress makes that decision, not the Secretary. Should Congress decide in its wisdom to establish that museum, I think it should be established in a place and with sufficient funds to do it right. And so those would be my criteria for being enthusiastic about it. And we'll just have to all keep in touch with each other and see what makes sense.
Okay, back here. You're in the center. Okay, there and then there. All right.
Stuart Bernstein. I'm involved in a museum. The Diplomacy Foundation is building a museum dedicated to diplomacy. There's several hundred museums dedicated to the military, not one to diplomacy. And but my question is, when are we going to have parking on the mall to take care of all the 28 million people that are coming to visit?
You know the old phrase, this one's above my pay grade? This one's above my pay grade. No, you can't talk, Albert. But, but I'll just say one thing about diplomacy. I salute you for working on that project. One of the things I feel really strongly about, very strongly about, is that we don't pay enough attention or give enough credit to the diplomatic corps around the world. This is a network of individuals, professionals, who come to the job, various different, trajectories, who in a troubled world do a lot to keep people connected with each other, to overcome difficult circumstances. And every chance I have, I say that. They had a real nice reception for me at the residence of the ambassador from Monaco, and I had a chance to talk to some portion of the diplomatic corps. I really think that's important, and I salute you for doing that. I hope you'll keep in touch with me so I can follow your progress.
So for those who haven't followed,
Yeah, I'm not sure how good. I'm an amateur at museums, but you can sure come and have a cup of coffee with me, sure. That'd
for
be
those who haven't followed, Albert Small is part of an effort to build an underground parking facility under the mall. It might take quite a while to get that approved and so forth, but there is an effort. I don't know if it'll ever get done, but Albert is
Got to
working.
give Albert credit for caring about it.
Okay, right here in the center, the hardest place to get a mic to.
Hello. There was a study done by the Center for the Future of Museums a few years ago, and if I remember correctly, it said that 1 in 10 core museum visitors is a person of color. Looking ahead at the demographic change, that it's already happened, and it's by 2042, right? That number, that is not going to be a white majority here in this country. I definitely see that there's not a lot of people of color when I visit museums. Maybe the Smithsonian is a little different because a lot of tourists. And when we look at the leadership in museums, definitely we see an absence of people of color. The Smithsonian is a very influential institution with a lot of resources, a lot of influence. What is the Smithsonian doing to change this in your institutions, but also in other museums?
Can't thank you enough for asking that question. I'm very concerned about diversifying the leadership workforce throughout the nonprofit part of our country, particularly in museums. I'm sure you're aware of the Mellon Foundation study published not too long ago that put a lot of data to this question, and it's a huge, huge problem. So people that came before me at the Smithsonian were already working on this problem. Janetta Cole, former president of Spelling, and the director of the National Museum of African Art, has been working with support from the Ford Foundation on this problem related within the Smithsonian itself. And she and I and a whole team of others are working on a very comprehensive approach, which actually we're going to bring to the Board of Regents in the not too distant future, to try hard to do a better job of not only increasing the compositional diversity, but also the climate for diversity. And those who have worked in diversity in large organizations know that the first step is to recruit people of a wide variety of backgrounds and change the initial composition. But the only way to retain that diverse workforce is to make the climate, the work climate, such that people want to stay and can succeed and fulfill their dreams. And so we're working on that, and when we get our own house in better order in that regard, which, as I said, people were way on this before my time, then I really hope that we can branch out, through the American Alliance of Museums and so on, and try to do better nationally. And I've already had a conversation with the head of the American Alliance of Museums, Laura Lott, about this.
Okay. Other questions? Here's one.
First, thank you so much to you and the board for caring for our nation's treasure. Quick question about religion. It's a very difficult topic, but very infused in our national consciousness. And the Smithsonian doesn't have a kind of a piece like that. And there's new projects, the National Museum of American Religion, which is not a Smithsonian project. Could you say a bit about how religion's addressed? There's an incredible Philadelphia Museum on American Judaic and Jewish history. Any thoughts on that?
It's one of those issues that I firmly believe if we knew more about each other's cultures, if we really understood if you're a believer or not a believer, if we understood the scriptures of what I'm calling scriptures of different faiths, I think we'd have a lot less aggravation than we currently have in the world. And it's been an interest of my wife and mine for quite a while. If you look in our personal library at home, you'll see all the scriptures from all the major world religions. from the Bhagavad Gita to the Holy Quran. And, you know, we're amateurs, we just like to study about it, but what appear to be very, very substantial differences, at least in the way things were originally conceived, fade away as you look into that. So I think efforts to understand things better are always good. Again, before my time, I take no credit for these very good ideas. The director of the National Museum of American History, John Gray, we're going to have an exhibition on religion. Perhaps you know about that. And I think it's going to be either late 17 or early 18. I apologize, I forgot what date. Do you happen to know?
No, but
But it's coming. And then we're going to have a display of Qur'ans at the Sackler Gallery coming right up this fall, either September or October. Also an attempt to share, now in that case, the art and culture related to the Quran.
mention you have the Thomas Jefferson Bible. Doesn't the Smithsonian own that Thomas Jefferson Bible?
I'm embarrassed, I don't know. I don't know. We did get our colleague who was in Israel and made that kind remark that you cut her off, which I could have gone on longer. But anyway, the Technion donated a thing called a Nano Bible to the Smithsonian, which is the size of a grain of sand and has the whole Old Testament on it.
Okay, other questions right here?
Other than the Smithsonian and its various affiliates, what's your second favorite museum?
Second favorite after the Smithsonian.
After the Smithsonian.
Well, and I'm going to get in trouble with anybody that I talk to in Washington. There's a lot of gorgeous museums. I like the National Gallery of Art. I have the privilege of being on their board, and it used to be part of the Smithsonian. It's a very, very impressive place, beautifully put together, and I like that place. But I like a lot of other museums there as well. The Newseum is terrific. There's a lot of good ones.
Okay. Other questions? There's a person from the museum, Shelby Coffey. Shelby, okay.
It is. It's
All right.
fantastic. Fantastic.
And actually, the head of the museum is in Aspen somewhere. He's might not be here right now, but okay.
I think we'd all like to know what the 17 museums are, because you keep talking about the same one or two or three.
Yeah. No, thank you. It's a very, very important point. So let me see if I can do this off the top of my head. I'm not David Rubenstein. I don't have that kind of memory. So in New York City, there is the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum and the Museum of the American Indian High, HEYE Center. In Washington, we have the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which also includes, which we count, the Renwick Gallery recently reopened, and the National Portrait Gallery. They both together comprise the Reynolds Center, brought together by a courtyard that was donated by one of our board members, Robert Kogod Courtyard. Around the mall, we have the National Museum of the American Indian. I hope somebody's counting because I'm not. We have the National Air and Space Museum. We have the Hirshhorn Museum, which is our contemporary art museum. We have the National Museum of African Art. We have the Sackler Gallery, the Freer Gallery. We have the castle itself as an information center, has some collections and is counted among those. We have the National Museum of Natural History. We have the National Air and Space Museum Udvar Hazy Center, which is near Dulles. If you're ever near Dulles Airport for some reason, I mean, you'd be there because you're going to Dulles, there is this museum 10 minutes from there. The display area is the size of 3 football fields. It's unbelievable. The whole Enola Gay is there. There's things there that just take your breath away. David, what did I forget?
Well, the Anacostia Museum.
Anacostia Community Museum is a very important one just across the Anacostia River in southeast Washington.
The Arts and Industry is counted as a museum, I think, for these purposes.
For this purpose, because it does periodically have collections. And there's one more I'm forgetting.
The zoo,
Oh,
the National Zoo.
No, but that's not counted among the 19. Oh, I didn't name that. National Museum of American History. That's it. Yeah, those are the 17.
So,
And the National Zoological Park, which is really fun, is there. They have pandas. Maybe you haven't heard about that yet, but they have pandas there. And part of the reason the pandas are cared for so well is that David Rubenstein devoted funding to develop a panda center. Because my name is David, and because his name is David, when the new panda cub was born, and the 2 first ladies came, and I actually escorted the 2 first ladies. I mean, I was nervous as can be, but I escorted them. and they were going to name the panda. I really thought they would name the panda David. David. But they named the panda Bebe.
Yeah.
And that was also above my pay grade.
Well, the next panda maybe we'll get. All right, one last question we have time for. This lady right here. This is the last question, and it is?
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that you think new and emerging technology should play in the Smithsonian in the future.
New technology?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a great thing to end the session on. That's the question. And my predecessor, two predecessors before me, Wayne Clough, decided, a very fine engineer, decided to what he called democratize the collection by digitizing as much of it as possible. And what I mean by digitizing depends on what we're looking at. But taking a picture through a digital camera basically is what it is. And some of the museums, for example, the Freer and Sackler galleries, their entire collection, including the vast majority that's not on display, is all in digital form now. So that's an obvious thing. Now it's obvious. It wasn't obvious when he started. So that's one thing that we're continuing to do. Secondly, we're using technology to interact with the public and going to do more of that in the future. The big question, and I speak about this as someone who worked in digital technology, digital imaging, the question will be, how far will we go down the path of either augmented or virtual reality? And I personally think that augmented reality will have more of a role in museums where you'll be standing in front of an object, and augmented reality, you'll put a pair of goggles on, you'll actually see the object that's there, and it'll be put in context. So perhaps the Magna Carta, you're looking at the actual Magna Carta, but you put the goggles on and you see what was going on the day it was signed, that kind of thing. And so, stay tuned for that. But if you have ideas about that, if you're in that field, send me a note, skortond@si.edu, because we're gathering information about that right now.
So there are no more opportunities like $500,000 and you got a whole, institution named after you, but we do have naming opportunities. And we have done some research that shows that those people who give to the Smithsonian live longer. So if any of you are interested in a long life, you might consider giving to the Smithsonian. David, I want to thank you for a great job you're doing as secretary. Thank you.